Welcome to episode 3 of Pro Wrestling in 1990. Episode 3, we are covering the AWA, the American Wrestling Association, and what would ultimately be their final year in business. So we're going to start off in January 1990. Champions going into 1990 are AWA World Heavyweight Champion, the living legend Larry Zbyszko, the AWA World Tag Team Champions, the Destruction Crew, and the AWA Women's World Champion, Candy Devine. And the AWA World Light Heavyweight Championship is held by Mike Graham, but I'm not 100% sure he was defending it in 1990, but it would be vacated and there would be a new champion crown later on in the year. Starting off 1990, we get a continuation of the storyline in 1989, that being the Team Challenge Series. The Team Challenge Series were 3 teams, each with 1 captain, and the rest of the roster being split off into these 3 teams. These 3 teams were captained by Larry Zbyszko, and Larry's Legends was the name of the team, Baron Von Raschke and Baron's Blitzers, and Sergeant Slaughter and Sarge's Snipers. Every single member of the roster were split off into these teams, men, women, everybody. This storyline would last the majority of the year. It would end in November, but it was recorded in August. But before we get into what happened all the way in August and November, let's get into what happened in January and beyond. Larry Zbyszko's first challenger in the new year would be on February 10th, in Japan. I believe it was New Japan, where he would be challenged by Masa Saito. And weirdly enough, Masa Saito won the title that night. So we had a brand new AWA World Heavyweight Champion, Masa Saito. Saito and Zbyszko would feud until the first really big show of the year, Superclash 4. We're going to get into the Superclash 4 card in just a second, but a brief history on what Superclash is. Superclash was basically started to compete with Vince McMahon and WrestleMania. This was going to be a super show that would have AWA, NWA, and all sorts of territories join in to do one super show. The first one was in 1985, and it didn't go really to plan because the promoters were backstabbing each other left and right. So it really became the AWA's big show, not every year. The second one would happen in 1987, and it would see Curt Hennig, the future Mr. Perfect, win the AWA World Heavyweight title from Nick Bockwinkel. The third one was the first time it would be, and only time it would be a pay-per-view actually, and it would be one world, one title. Kerry Von Erich, the WCCW World Heavyweight Champion, and Jerry the King Lawler representing CWA in Memphis, and he was the AWA World Heavyweight Champion. Jerry the King Lawler would win that match, and Superclash 3 would take place in 1988. Superclash 4 would take place April 8th, 1990. 8 days after WrestleMania 6, one of the biggest shows of all time that saw Warrior and Hogan fight for both the WWF World Heavyweight and Intercontinental titles. It really shows how far the AWA had gone down by this point, when Superclash was just basically a house show. So let's talk a little bit about Superclash 4, some of the matches and some of the names on this card. Tully Blanchard defeated Tommy Jammer. Tully Blanchard had been in the WWF in 1989 as part of the Brainbusters tag team and part of the Heenan family. Right before the Survivor Series in 1989, Tully failed a drug test and was gone from the WWF immediately. The original plan was for Tully and Arn Anderson, the Brainbusters in the WWF, to go back to the NWA. But the NWA found out about his failed drug test and they pulled the contract, so he was not going to the NWA. And the original plan in the NWA was to reform the Horsemen, the original 4 Horsemen too. Tully, Arn, Ric Flair, and Ole Anderson. But that would not happen. But his father, Joe Blanchard, was working with the AWA, so he would go to the AWA for a portion of 1990. I was always a fan of Tully Blanchard. He was always my favorite Horseman in the original Horseman. If I would have had the book in the AWA, Tully Blanchard would have been my World Heavyweight Champion. but he would retire a few years after this. His career would never really get back on track. Another match at Superclash 4 saw Yukon John Nord defeat Kokina Maximus. Both these wrestlers would find their way into the WWF in the coming years. Yukon John Nord would be the Berserker, and Kokina Maximus would be two-time WWF World Heavyweight Champion Yokozuna. In Kokina Maximus' corner would be Sheik Adnan El-Kaisi, someone that was in the AWA since the 70s. This would be his final year in the AWA. It would have been his final year anyway, and we'll get to that at the end. But he would leave in the summer of 1990 to become General Adnan in the WWF. Larry Zbyszko would win back the AWA World Heavyweight title from Masa Saito on this card, and Larry Zbyszko would carry the title for the rest of 1990. This would not end the show, though, as the main event would be a non-title steel cage match. Paul Diamond and the Trooper beat the AWA World Tag Team Champions, the Destruction Crew, Mike Enos and Wayne Bloom. Superclash would be recorded, and you can find Superclash 4 on YouTube for free. It wasn't the best show ever. I mean, 8 days before that, there was WrestleMania 6, and this looks like territory wrestling compared to WrestleMania 6, but for historical purposes, I do recommend it. One thing that I want to mention, in watching a few of these shows in 1990, they have a stupid you can't come off the top rope rule, and that has ended plenty of matches, but the guy coming off the top rope is getting disqualified. Another big name from the 80s wrestling for the AWA at this point in time is Nikita Koloff, and it makes me question why he's in the AWA, because he was a really big deal in the NWA, and now he's in the AWA that's really on its last legs. But since he's there, why not make him the AWA World Heavyweight Champion? I'm not crapping on Larry Zbyszko. I just feel like there were better choices than Larry Zbyszko. I get it, he was Vern's son-in-law, and he could trust his son-in-law, at least he thought he could. But you had Tully Blanchard, Nikita Koloff, even Sergeant Slaughter. They would have all made way better world champions than Larry Zbyszko. One of the storylines in the Team Challenge series is Sergeant Slaughter and Colonel De Beers not getting along, yet they're teammates. So that was one of the big storylines happening there. They would never see eye to eye in the ring or on promos. De Beers would even turn some of Slaughter's teammates against him. And that storyline would never really see a conclusion, because by summer, Sergeant Slaughter is off to the WWF, and by 1991, he was the WWF World Heavyweight Champion. The top tag team and tag team champions were the Destruction Crew, Mean Mike Enos and Wayne the Train Bloom. Their promos always entertained me, because Wayne Bloom would always do the talking. When Mike Enos would try to talk, Wayne would say, let me take care of this one, and Mike Enos would never talk. It's the kind of thing you would see when a tag team is about to split up, but they would never split up in the AWA, and would be in the WWF in 1991 as the Beverly Brothers. Now, we're going to get into August real quick. I know I'm skipping over a lot of things, but there's not a lot happening in the AWA. Just matches involving the Team Challenge series, weird gimmick matches, Raw turkey matches, and body slam matches, and weird football style matches where you have to tackle people, and just nothing really worth talking about. But in August of 1990, the AWA World Light Heavyweight title would see a new champion when the illustrious Johnny Stewart would take on Buck Zumhofe. Buck Zumhofe would win the title. The less said about this guy, the better. He's a scumbag. I would have really put the belt on the illustrious Johnny Stewart. In watching these shows, I became a fan of Johnny Stewart. He is entertaining. I like him. Also in August, we would see new AWA World Tag Team Champions as DJ Peterson and the Trooper would win the titles. The Trooper is an interesting character because he was being pushed really hard in the AWA. Earlier on in the year, he would challenge Larry Zbyszko for the AWA World Heavyweight title, and they would go to a TV time limit draw. So he didn't lose to the champion, but he didn't win the title. The Trooper later on would become the Patriot, and he would make his way to the WWF in 1997. By August, Sergeant Slaughter had left for the WWF. General Adnan was on his way out as well. And in August, they were recording their last set of TV tapings that would air throughout September, October, and November. The Team Challenge series would finally see an end when Jake the Milkman Millman would win a Battle Royal, winning the Team Challenge series for Larry's Legends. In the promo at the end, you would see Larry Zbyszko, the AWA World Heavyweight Champion, the Destruction Crew, and the Texas Hangman, and also Jake the Milkman Millman. The story of Jake Millman in the Team Challenge series is kind of funny. He's the ultimate underdog. Zbyszko doesn't really want him on his team, but Jake Millman basically wins the Team Challenge series for Zbyszko. As far as Larry Zbyszko as the AWA World Heavyweight Champion, by December of 1990, Larry Zbyszko leaves the AWA for the NWA, and the AWA World Heavyweight title is declared vacant. And in the original AWA run, that's it. There is no more champions. It's kind of mind-blowing to me to know that 1990 is the last real full year of the original AWA. As a kid growing up in the 90s, I never knew about the AWA. I found out about the AWA through ESPN Classic Canada in the early 2000s. I'd watch these old AWA shows in the early 2000s, and it's the first time I'd see Jesse Ventura and Hulk Hogan before they would make it to the WWF. The original plan for the AWA was crown a new champion. Who could it have been? Who knows? It might have been the Trooper. They might have went with a heel. We'll never know, because in 1991, the AWA would fold for good. Vern Gagne owned a piece of property, and the government wanted it to create a tourist attraction, I believe it was. And Vern said no. Vern was going to fight it, and Vern basically lost that battle. And that was basically the downfall of the AWA right there. This happened in January of 1991. They had a few shows in January, but it was over. If you think of all the major stars that came out of the AWA, from Hulk Hogan to Jesse the Body Ventura, Andre the Giant, the Rockers, the Nasty Boys, and it goes on and on and on. The AWA was a great place for wrestlers to go. But by the late 80s, if the wrestlers would get too big, the WWF would snatch them up, or the NWA would snatch them up. They were never safe. If they'd get too big, the AWA would lose them to the bigger companies. One of the biggest problems Vern Gagne had was refusing to change with the times. You look at who he had as his world champion, and then you look at the other companies and who they had as their world champion. I'm sorry, I'd rather watch The Ultimate Warrior and Sting any day of the week over Larry Zbyszko. A lot of people ask the question, what could have been done to save the AWA? The simple answer is nothing. Vern Gagne was an old school territory guy, and that's the wrestling he wanted to do. If he couldn't do that wrestling, he wasn't going to do that wrestling, but he was going to keep trying to do that wrestling. And the only reason he stopped trying is because he ran out of money, because of that government dispute. But in the end, I feel like the AWA should be celebrated, because once it went out of business, it wasn't there anymore. You can't go watch it. Whether it was good or bad, there were a lot of great memories with the AWA. You look at the AWA in the 80s, especially in the early 80s, maybe the late 70s too, you got a lot of great storylines, a lot of great feuds. Even Hulkamania started in the AWA. It was definitely something that was missed in the mid-90s, because the mid-90s was really a darker time where there was just WWF, WCW, and ECW. And with that, I would like to thank you all for listening to episode 3 of Pro Wrestling in 1990 AWA. Our next episode will cover the Maritime, something that's very near and dear to my heart, obviously. We will be looking at Atlantic Grand Prix Wrestling, or World Grand Prix Wrestling as it was known back then, in 1990. Again, thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.